What's the most useless superpower you have? Can you wiggle your eyebrows? Do you speak fluent Morse code? Has anyone ever told you that your jokes are really not that funny? Here's one useless superpower that definitely will and help you survive a zombie apocalypse, knowing useless facts. Hi, I'm here to share useless facts you don't need but will never forget. London in the mid-1600s was not exactly the kind of place you'd want to book for a weekend getaway. The city smelled like an open sewer, half the streets were filled with filth, and then, just to keep things fun, the plague showed up. People were dying left, right, and center. But here's the strange part. While bodies piled up, Londoners turned to their favorite form of medicine: alcohol. Yes, instead of staying indoors, many ran to taverns and alehouses, because apparently nothing says, "Protect me from the Black Death," like a jug of warm beer. It wasn't just fun, it was survival, or at least they thought so. Doctors of the time recommended alcohol as a cure-all. Some claimed wine could purify the blood, while gin, a rising star in London, supposedly strengthened the spirits. The logic was simple. If disease was in the air, then surely drowning yourself in alcohol was the only rational thing to do. Of course, the result was that London wasn't just sick with plague, it was also stumbling drunk most of the time. Hey, now that you've learned this useless fact, what useless facts do you know? Share them below because knowledge is power. And who doesn't want more power? Now, I am going to take a break from sharing useless facts so I can work on my drinking problem. If you've ever accidentally gazed at your reflection in a spoon, then you've probably noticed that you do and look the same when you re-looking straight on as when you re-looking at an angle. Why is that? Because your face has some pretty weird lopsided features that you probably didn't realize were asymmetrical. You're not as symmetrical as you think. Your eyes are obviously different sizes. One pupil is always bigger than the other. Your nose isn't centered, it's actually off to one side. And your mouth sits in the middle of your face like it's playing charades as the letter O. As for why our faces are like this, experts aren't 100% sure, but they have some theories. It could be something called dynamic asymmetry. When you're young, your brain gets most of its motor information from one side of your body, which ends up developing those asymmetrical facial features. Or it could just be something totally random. After all, we're all a little lopsided. We're just too busy staring at our phones to notice. Now that you know this useless fact, what useless fact can you teach me? Please share below. I'm desperate for some new useless facts. At this point, you're probably wondering how I come up with these useless facts. My research process begins with scouring the internet for anything remotely interesting. I read it, then I decide whether it's too useful or not useful enough to make the cut. Then I write the script, film it, edit it, add some music, publish it, and now I'm just waiting for the Nobel Prize Committee to get back to me. If there's one thing I've learned from all my research, it's that life is short, so eat dessert first. That's one useful fact you can use to make the most of your time on Earth. Now that you know this fact, please share one of your own. I love reading what you write. Also, a big thank you to my supporters for supporting my channel. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos, so be like them. Go to the website to learn more. And until next time, remember I shot first. Have you ever gone to a tavern? Of course you have. We all have. It's a nice place to hang out, get some food and drink, maybe meet some interesting people or get into a fist fight and break the nose of some complete stranger who insulted your mother. But whatever draws you to these establishments, one thing's for sure, they smell amazing. The inviting aroma of roasting meats, fresh bread and creamy stews mixed with a hint of stale waste and chamber pots makes a truly unique perfume that is, well, pretty much indescribable. But if you want to experience what it was like to go to a tavern during the bubonic plague, keep listening because we're about to take you back in time. Welcome to my channel. Today we'll explore what life was like in 17th century England when plague and pestilence ran rampant through the countryside and people did their best to drink it away. As the Black Death swept across Europe, killing millions in its wake, the English town of London found itself in the grip of a terrifying new outbreak. With the disease raging and people dropping dead in the streets, Londoners understandably became terrified. which led them to abandon all pretense of decorum and dignity, and were better to let loose than in the local tavern. By the middle of the 17th century, alehouses had become the real heartbeat of London. And while people weren't necessarily happier, they were definitely drunker. Because when faced with death, what other logical response is there besides heavy drinking? And those who drank together were far less likely to die alone. Well, that was the theory anyway. In reality, alehouses were packed not because life was cheerful, but because people were afraid of dying. Outside, carts were making their rounds, collecting the dead and dying to be buried in mass graves. But inside, the air was thick with the sounds of people clinking mugs and shouting drinking songs. So if you were an unfortunate soul wandering the streets of London in the year 1665, you might find yourself raising a tankard of ale with a motley crew of fellow citizens, including old Mr. Tibbs, who insisted on singing a sea shanty about a mythical mermaid that he once saw off the coast of Africa, and Mrs. Miggins, a portly woman whose husband had died of the plague and she was determined to drink his share of ale too. Not to mention young Master Thomas, whose parents locked him out of the house because he was getting too drunk and throwing up on their freshly cleaned floor. Now, what were they drinking, you ask? Ale. Everyone drank ale. And not just any ale, but beer made with spring water collected from a secret, unpolluted well deep in the woods by Old Man Withers. He swore the water was blessed by fairies and protected drinkers from harm. How do we know he was wrong? Well, plenty of drunkards died just as fast as the sober folks, but that didn't stop anyone from chugging down their suds and howling for another. You see, fear turned into binge drinking, which led people to believe that alcohol offered a kind of protection from the plague. After all, if the disease could kill you, it must hate alcohol, right? So they drank to excess, hoping to create some sort of protective chemical barrier in their bodies that would repel the plague. Basically, drink now, worry later. There was also a baleful elixir, a potent mix of wine, brandy, camphor, cloves, and other spices that supposedly cured the plague. But if it did, it wasn't very good at it. Still, people lined up to buy the mysterious medicine, which might have been why London taverns never emptied during the plague. After all, who wants to leave a warm, crowded room full of lively music and easy conversation when outside death stalks the streets? Why go out at all when you can stay inside and drink your worries away? Of course, that was the theory. In reality, people simply couldn't escape the plague, no matter how much they drank. But that didn't stop them from trying. So you all know about the gin craze of the 1700s, right? How gin and tonic was invented, how the French came in and took a big old dump on everyone's party, how the English responded by making gin palaces where they sold you gin. But have you ever wondered where gin came from before that? Well, strap in, my friends, because today we are going back to the days of the Black Death. That's right. While most people associate gin with the 18th century, gin was already sneaking into London taverns in the 1600s, and it was so popular among the poor, it became known as the poor man's drink. This was even at a time when gin was basically just a bootleg version of vodka, a cheap imitation made from grain that wasn't fit for human consumption. So why did people drink it? Well, because it was both cheap and strong, stronger than beer, and easier to get than wine. You see, during plague times, there were two ways to get gin. You could visit one of the many illicit distilleries hidden away in London's slums and buy your gin from a shady dealer. Or you could go to a street vendor and purchase one of these bottles labeled medicinal. And don't let the name fool you. There was nothing medicinal about these bottles. They were just gin. The only difference was that the people selling them claimed that it would cleanse your insides and cure your ailments. Now, spoiler alert, it didn't, but it did make people forget that their neighbors were dropping dead from the plague. And let's be real here, why wouldn't people want to forget that? I mean, when you're knee-deep in rat and flea-infested water, surrounded by the corpses of your friends and family, and the only thing keeping you alive is the hope that you might get out of this alive to tell the story, gin was the perfect distraction. For some, that meant drinking gin straight from tin cups in filthy taverns while watching the plague take out their fellow Londoners. For others, it meant buying those medicinal bottles and heading home to drink in the safety of their own chambers. Either way, the gin trade was booming. And since it was unregulated, anyone and everyone was selling it. I mean, remember those apothecaries we talked about in our last video? Yeah, they were selling gin too. They were peddling it to the masses as a cure-all, promising that it would help with everything from headaches to heart disease. They even went so far as to publish books with recipes for using gin medicinally. And don't get me wrong, those recipes were great. I mean, who doesn't love a good gin and treacle pudding or a nice glass of gin, urine, and small beer? But seriously, if you were using gin to treat a fever, you were probably doing more harm than good. But people kept drinking it because life was scary and gin made it just a little less so. It gave them an escape from the horrors of the plague, a brief respite from the fear that had become their new reality. And let's be honest, if you were living in a city filled with rats, fleas, and disease, you'd probably keep drinking too. So next time you pour yourself a gin and tonic, take a moment to remember that it was born out of fear. At a time when the world was full of sickness and death, people turned to gin as a way to cope. It was a drink that helped them forget the darkness that surrounded them, a brief escape from the horrors of the plague. Now, what do you think? Did you know that gin was around during the plague? Do you think you'd drink it if you were there? Let me know your thoughts below, and as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye. You know what's really funny about the plague? It gave rise to an entire economy of quack doctors hawking miracle cures, and almost all of them included alcohol. Want to protect your lungs from infection? Drink brandy mixed with herbs. Want to keep the miasma out of your blood? Red wine, of course. Want to forget that your entire street has been boarded up due to infection? A barrel of ale will do nicely. But what were they drinking exactly? How did people get their alcohol during the plague? To answer that question, let's take a little trip to 17th century London. Imagine yourself strolling down a sunny street, enjoying the sweet scent of flowers wafting from every window box. You stop to admire a pair of bejeweled slippers in a shop window when suddenly a piercing cry pierces the air. You turn to see a woman dragging herself along the sidewalk, her body racked with sobs. She collapses at your feet, clutching her chest. Before you can help her, she's dead. You watch in horror as another man stumbles out of his house, takes one look at the woman's body, and falls down dead in the street. Well, it only took a few seconds for the miasma to kill him. That is, assuming you survived the plague long enough to get this far into the story. Now, if you've somehow managed not to die, there's only one thing to do. Drink some plague wine. Plague wine? What's that? Glad you asked. Despite its name, plague wine wasn't just a particularly robust vintage. It was an entire category of alcoholic beverages, each one supposedly offering a unique chemical cocktail designed to fend off the plague. Like our story's unfortunate protagonist, most Londoners probably didn't have access to these fancy concoctions. Instead, they turned to the nearest tavern or alehouse for their daily dose of preventative medicine. These weren't carefully crafted recipes. They were basically whatever people could find mixed into alcohol. Nutmeg, wormwood, pepper, even crushed pearls. The recipe varied from household to household, but the ingredients had one thing in common: alcohol. And that wasn't a coincidence. During the plague, alcohol became less about enjoyment and more about routine survival. It was the one constant in a city full of chaos. Every morning, Londoners would wake up knowing that they might die today, but also knowing that they'd probably be too drunk to notice if they did. In the midst of so much uncertainty, alcohol offered a strange sort of comfort. Most of these folks weren't alcoholics by nature, but they were becoming alcoholics by necessity. We don't have much evidence of how these drinks actually tasted, but we can make an educated guess. Caraway seeds, a common ingredient in plague wine, have a distinct anise flavor, while wormwood, which we use to make absinthe, has a bitter, minty flavor. So your average plague wine probably tasted like a particularly nasty martini. But hey, at least it was doing a job. There was no shortage of people hawking miracle cures for the plague, from physicians to priests. But for the average Londoner, the best treatment was probably a good night's drinking. After all, why bother curing the disease when you could just drink your way through it? Of course, this didn't work in the end. The plague raged through London for years, killing hundreds of thousands of people. But for those few precious months each year when the weather was warm and the sun shone through the smoky haze, people found solace in a simple routine, a routine that began with a bottle of cheap wine. Thank you for watching. Alright, so imagine you are the wealthy elite in 1665 London. You hear that the plague is coming, so what do? You escape the city, right? You flee to the countryside and live out the rest of the summer in a bucolic paradise where the air is clean. The fields are green, and the only thing you have to worry about is whether you're gonna get a decent tan. But now imagine you are poor and unlucky enough to be stuck in London during the plague. You can't just take off work and go frolicking through the countryside. You have to stay in the city and keep working because you have to put food on the table. And the best you can hope for is that your new assignment is at one of the many taverns that are still open, serving up beer and gin to all comers. So here's the deal with drinking during the plague. Yeah, it was a way to blow off some steam and forget about how horrible everything was. But it wasn't exactly a fun social lubricant that made people feel warm and fuzzy inside. It was more like a necessary evil that helped people endure the horror around them. And this attitude is reflected in the types of drinks that people were consuming. Most of these poor Londoners were drinking gin and beer, not wine. Wine was too expensive. Gin and beer were the drinks of the working class. In fact, in 1662, Parliament passed a law that made it illegal to serve beer unless it was mixed with gin. Why? Well, the thinking was that mixing the two would cut down on drunkenness. But we all know how that turned out. The Gin Act of 1662 backfired spectacularly. Not only did people drink more, they started drinking differently. Many workers were paid in gin, meaning that drinking wasn't just a way to blow off some steam at the end of a long day. It was part of their survival wages. Imagine if your boss paid you for your week's work with a gift card to the local tavern. That's what it was like for many Londoners. The tavern owner would give the worker 3 pints of gin, and then that worker would go out and try to find food somewhere else. In a way, it was a clever system for the ruling class. If you were a landowner, you could pay your workers with gin instead of gold. And that meant that you didn't have to pay them nearly as much because you didn't have to pay them in actual currency. And then those same workers would spend the money they did earn at the tavern, helping to stimulate the economy and make the rich even richer. It's no wonder then that the tavern became such a central part of life during the plague. People went there to drink, yes, but also to socialize and share rumors and swap cures for the plague and toast to the fact that they were still alive. And even though alcohol couldn't save them from the plague, it did offer a temporary escape from the horrors around them. After all, being drunk was better than being hungry, scared, or mourning someone who had died. So yeah, Londoners drank to dull the misery, even if it didn't cure anything. And in a way, that's still what we do when we drink to excess, isn't it? We drink to escape our problems, even if it doesn't solve them. Except unlike Londoners during the plague, most of us have the luxury of not having to work while we drink. Most of us, anyway. And speaking of drinking, I should probably get started on my first drink of the day. It's been a rough week and I need a stiff drink. How about you? What's your poison? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you next week. Hi, it's me, and now back to our story. Naturally, authorities tried to regulate all this drinking. Taverns were sometimes closed during outbreaks, but that only made people smuggle in drinks or open secret alehouses. Bans never lasted long because, frankly, London would have rioted if denied alcohol. Even during plague-time sermons, preachers condemned drunkenness as sinful. But here's the irony. Many clergymen themselves relied on strong drink to guard against infection. Apparently the devil was in the bottle, but so was salvation. So the government's attempts to sober up London failed spectacularly. People just kept drinking as though gin was the only thing keeping civilization from collapsing entirely. But why? Why was gin so popular? Gin is made from grain, which gives it its distinctive juniper flavor. Grain was cheap and plentiful in 18th century England. And unlike wine, gin could be made in large quantities without expensive equipment or a whole lot of expertise. It was also a very versatile spirit. You could mix it with beer to cut down on costs. You could drink it neat or mix it with water for a cheaper alternative to brandy. You could even use it as a base for medicines. which is what many people did since gin and beer were believed to cure everything from headaches to venereal disease. Gin was also an intoxicant that could get you drunk if that's what you were after. In other words, it was the original hard seltzer, only without the headache. No wonder Londoners loved it. Most of them probably drank it from a mug, though. The classic gin and tonic actually originated in India, where British soldiers drank gin mixed with water and lime juice, a drink we can be thankful they brought back home, since it helped ease the intense homesickness that comes from shooting tigers with your bare hands. Still, gin wasn't the only drink keeping London running. Beer was immensely popular as well. During the plague, people drank beer from tankards or possets, a type of mug. The classic London pub actually started out as a coffee house that served beer. They were called coffee houses because beer was often adulterated with water, making it weak. So, Londoners who wanted a stronger brew went to these establishments to get their full-strength beer served in tankards. Over time, the places became known simply as taverns. Anyway, by the 18th century, beer was being served in pubs, a word that evolved from public house. Wine was also drunk, though not as much as beer or gin. Cheap wine came from France and Portugal, though most of it was probably fortified, meaning it had brandy added to it to help preserve it. Londoners also favored cider, which was made from apples. That was until 1662, when a severe blight swept through England, killing off most of the apple trees. This led to a gin and beer boom. And fun fact, the same blight also hit France and Italy, though they recovered faster due to warmer temperatures. Still, despite all the drinking, some people in London did try to stay sober. One group was the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. Founded by George Fox in the mid-17th century, the Quakers believed in a simple life free from the temptations of society, including alcohol. For this reason, they didn't drink. Members of this sect were often persecuted for their beliefs, but they persisted and eventually became a respected part of London life. Though we may not know their names, we can thank the Quakers for inventing the bar off button. In the end, though, gin and beer won out over temperance. And not just in London, but across England. During the plague, the king even lifted taxes on beer and cider, believing that gin was helping to spread the disease. But that didn't stop anyone from drinking. Anything to keep the fever away, I suppose. So next time you raise a glass of gin and beer, remember that you're following a very old English tradition. And when you finish the bottle, you might want to check for a cure for baldness or syphilis, because who knows? You might just find one. I'm here to talk about gin. No, seriously, let's talk about gin. London went through a lot of it during the plague, so much that we can't even begin to count how much was drunk. There was so much drinking going on in the 1660s that it didn't stop with the plague. It just sort of rolled into the next century and fueled what we now call the gin craze. London survived the plague, but barely. And mostly, really, it was a haze of alcohol. So what's the story of how London got drunk on death? It's me, and this is the story of the plague. It's ironic, isn't it? The plague killed so many people, and yet it didn't kill London's love of drink. It supercharged it. People were scared, desperate, angry, and they were looking for something to numb that, and that thing was gin. They drank it neat, they drank it in beer, they drank it in cocktails, but most of all, they drank it to forget. When the plague arrived in London in 1665, people found themselves locked in their homes, unsure if they were gonna make it day to day. Some turned to religion, others turned to debauchery. In the end, it seems most turned to gin. By the time the plague burned itself out, London had gone through more alcohol than anyone could count. Drinking had become so normal that it didn't stop with the plague. It simply rolled into the next century, fueling what later became the gin craze. When the plague hit, gin was already popular, especially among the poor. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it gave people a temporary escape from the poverty and grime of life in 17th century London. With the plague killing hundreds every day, people started drinking more and more. Entire families would get drunk, and the children were given gin and beer to make the horror of the plague more bearable. It sounds crazy, but these children were better off getting drunk than catching the plague. The gin flowed so freely that taverns started staying open all night to serve those who craved it. And when the plague finally left London in 1666, people didn't stop drinking. They just added fire to their fury and started burning down London. Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration, but only a little one. After the plague, Londoners took their gin craze to new heights. It continued throughout the 1670s and into the 1680s. Gin shops opened everywhere, serving up cheap booze to anyone who wanted it. And since most people did want it, gin shops were always packed. Gin became so popular that people started making their own at home. They either bought cheap, unregulated spirits and mixed them with water, or they made their own rudimentary gin by distilling beer. Of course, gin was meant to be drunk with beer. After all, it was originally called Genever, which is Dutch for juniper-flavored beer. But Londoners weren't brewing their own special plague beer. They were just taking regular beer and turning it into something stronger, something that could help them forget about the plague just a little bit longer. And how did they do this? Well, they basically just put a lot of pressure on it. Beer was already fermented, so all they needed to do was boil it and then cool it down quickly. This would cause the alcohol to condense, and then they could collect it and drink it straight. It wasn't great beer, but it was stronger than the stuff they were used to drinking, which was mostly beer and water. So why not just drink the good stuff straight? Well, because they could. Gin became the drink of choice during the plague because it was cheap and easy to make. It was also easy to hide. You see, gin was clear, so it was hard to tell if someone was drunk. Also, it smelled like perfume, so it didn't reek of stale waste and chamber pots like beer and wine did. But while gin was great for hiding your drinking, it was terrible for hiding your sins. Gin-fueled crime became a huge problem in London. People were getting drunk and then robbing each other blind. They were also getting drunk and beating each other up and sometimes killing each other. Gin was blamed for everything from pickpocketing to murder. In the end, it was the gin craze and not the plague that killed London. Well, not exactly. The gin craze was bad, but it didn't kill London, not immediately anyway. But there's something to be said for the dangers of drinking yourself to death. So yeah, London's plague era wasn't just about death. It was also about coping with death by raising a glass. The city didn't sober up, it staggered forward, tankard in hand. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the channel, please consider becoming a patron. Your support helps us make the show better, and we really appreciate it.